There is an old saying, "What is done in the dock will be brought to the light." And by 1950, America had transformed from a sleeping giant into a global superpower, a colossus born not from the battlefield, but from cunning. They had watched the great European empires bleed themselves dry, the British, the Dutch, the Germans, the Italians, financing wars, supplying arms, and handing out loans, while the old world tore itself apart. When the smoke cleared, the once proud British Empire was gasping for breath. Europe was fractured, broken, and ripe for the picking. Winston Churchill, desperate and grasping, pleaded with America to join him in yet another crusade, this time against the rising Soviet tide. But men like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman saw things differently. They knew the age of Europe was over. The future, brutal, glittering and rich with opportunity, belonged to America. And with it came the docks, the lifelines of trade, the arteries of war and peace. Whoever controlled the docks controlled the new empire. In the shadows of this new world order, government agencies, the Office of Strategic Services, Naval Intelligence, and the Pentagon's newly sprouted arms began forging silent alliances with organized crime. They needed men who could control the ports, the unions, and the silent power of the waterfront. It was here, in the rotting underbelly of America's greatest cities, that national security and organized crime shook hands. Multiple clandestine operations, Operation X, Operation Gladio, and others whispered behind closed doors, grew from these roots. And by the early 1950s, the undisputed kings of the docks were tethered to a ruthless and deadly enforcer, Albert Anastasia. Anastasia, the so-called Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, was no rogue. He was a soldier's soldier, loyal beyond reason to Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. It was Luciano who had saved him from the electric chair. It was Costello he admired with a child's reverence. Anastasia wielded power like a blade, but he knelt to the men who had made him. As 1951 dawned, Anastasia and his sprawling empire of intimidation and blood would be dragged, kicking and snarling, into the harsh light of the American Senate. A Southern senator named Kefauver, naive to the true depths of power he was about to disturb, was preparing to peel back the lid on America's criminal underworld. His hearings would probe gambling, the policy racket, and the mafia's silent war for control of the booming casino industry. But they would only scratch the surface. They had no idea how deep the rot went, and how much of it began on the docks. It was a bitter January in Brooklyn, 1951, when the headlines screamed what everyone on the streets already knew: Anastasia Kin rules docks. On January 2nd, the Brooklyn Eagle reported that a former murder-for-money figure had been crowned the peer of peers, and his name was Anthony Anastasia. Tony Anastasia, brother of the infamous Albert, was no puppet. He had carved out his own empire with raw fists, fear, and savvy. Where Albert had moved across the river to New Jersey to chase bigger paydays in the national syndicate, Tony stayed behind, tightening his grip on Brooklyn's docks with brutal efficiency. Tony's men, dock wallopers loyal only to him, held the exclusive right to place longshoremen at some of the biggest piers in Brooklyn. His crowning jewel was the 2,200-foot pier of the Isthmian Line in the breakwater section. A sprawling behemoth where, from now on, only Anastasia-approved muscle would touch the freight. District Attorney Miles McDonald's investigators, already neck-deep in the Harry Gross bookmaking scandal, turned their gaze toward the mystic labyrinth of the waterfront rackets. They found a kingdom ruled not with contracts or politics, but with fear. The shakedowns were simple and vicious. Truckers were forced to cough up $18 to $20 extra just to load their trucks, a half-hour's work, and were often required to hire 2 or 3 additional men, whether they needed them or not. On a busy day, With 100 trucks moving through the piers every hour, the cash rolled in like the tide. And that was just the beginning. The real money lay in theft, stolen cargo that vanished with ghostly efficiency. Cases of canned pineapple, entire shipments, simply disappeared. As one informant told the Brooklyn Eagle, 300 or 400 cases can disappear like nothing from a pier. Sold on the black market at a fraction of their value, it was a racket as lucrative as it was invisible. The trial of Harry Gross would come soon enough, but the Waterfront probe was only just beginning. What they were uncovering was an empire, built in plain sight, ruled by blood and silence. By January 17th, the icy winds had carried new proposals into Albany, New York. The war against the Waterfront, and the gangsters who controlled it, was gathering steam. The Brooklyn Eagle reported that legislation had been introduced to finally shatter the shield that had protected men like Anastasia and Vito Genovese for so long. Senator Samuel Greenberg, a Brooklyn Democrat, sponsored 2 bills designed to drag the untouchables into the light. One bill would allow uncorroborated testimony from accomplices, a federal tactic that could now become state law. The other bill would upgrade gambling conspiracy from a misdemeanor to a felony, giving prosecutors real teeth. District Attorney Miles McDonald had been blunt. In a speech before the Brooklyn Bar Association, he declared that the existing laws were a cloak of invisibility for the criminal elite. As long as accomplice testimony required corroboration, men like Anastasia could hide behind the silence of their conspirators. No one would talk, because talking meant nothing. It is the gangster's greatest hope and the district attorney's constant headache, McDonald warned. Greenberg's bill sought to strip that protection away. If passed, it would allow a jury to weigh an accomplice's testimony directly, no outside evidence needed. And the second bill would hit harder. Gambling conspirators could face up to 5 years in prison, and habitual offenders could be sent away for life under the Baum's law. McDonald had no illusions. The fines levied against small-time gamblers were meaningless, just another cost of doing business. If they wanted to crack organized crime, they had to turn the runners, the lieutenants, against their bosses. And for that, they needed fear, real cold fear of prison time. The battle lines had been drawn. The docks, the courts, the Senate, all were converging on a showdown that would test the strength of America's new empire, and the criminal empires growing beneath it. By late January 1951, as the chill deepened across the East Coast, the rot within law enforcement itself was beginning to ooze into public view. In a quiet corner of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a retired police heavyweight named Frank Bals, former deputy commissioner and head of Brooklyn's short-lived confidential squad, broke his silence. Bals, speaking from the modest 5-room apartment he rented for $110 a month on Caron Drive, was bitter and defiant. His voice crackled with anger as he laid blame for the fall of his squad squarely at the feet of jealous colleagues within the New York Police Department. "They can investigate me from here to next year," Bals snarled to a reporter from the Brooklyn Eagle on January 27th. "I pay my bills. I have $10,000 in the bank, and the hell with all of them." He made it clear he had no intention of signing any waiver of immunity to testify before the grand jury now clawing through Brooklyn's festering waterfront. "If they want me to testify, they can pay my expenses. But if they expect me to sign a waiver, they can go to hell." His words, heavy with resentment, hung in the humid Florida air. Bals insisted that his confidential squad, a unit stripped of arrest powers but armed with latitude, had been effective. In just over a year, they had built a list of 5,000 names, criminals and near-criminals, who, he claimed, deserved watching. But envy poisoned the ranks. Poison pen letters had flowed like sewage, and Bals' squad had been dismantled under a cloud of whispered corruption. Still, Bals was adamant about one thing. He had no dirt under his fingernails. No bribes, no hidden accounts, no skeletons in the closet. When asked about past failures to convict figures like Albert Anastasia, Bals was blunt. There was never enough corroborated evidence to nail Anastasia, he said, brushing aside the accusations once levelled at then District Attorney William O'Dwyer. He had respect for District Attorney Miles MacDonald, a good man doing the best he can, but warned that the investigations were, in his words, looking in the wrong direction. Dig deeper, Bals hinted. Look back to the days of Fiorello LaGuardia. That is where the real rot had started. And then, almost as an afterthought, he offered a grim warning. Anything anybody says about me better be true, because if they play around with the facts, I will prove them wrong. The calendar rolled into February, and a bitter wind howled down the stone corridors of Albany. It was February 1st, 1951, when the Brooklyn Eagle reported the first real counterattack, not from the mobsters, but from the system itself. The legislation that District Attorney Miles MacDonald had so desperately pushed, the two-pronged assault aimed at tearing the veil of immunity off organized crime, was now floundering. Opposition was fierce. Criminal attorneys, legislators, and unnamed legal groups whispered against it, working behind closed doors to sink the bills before they ever saw the governor's desk. The first bill, which would allow juries to convict based solely on an accomplice's testimony, no corroboration required, was viewed with horror by many lawmakers. The second, which sought to reclassify gambling conspiracy as a felony instead of a misdemeanor, barely registered on the legislative radar. There was little real appetite to strengthen gambling laws. After all, gambling fines were good business, cheap, reliable, and safe for politicians. Miles MacDonald, undeterred, raged against the tide. As long as the law bars conviction upon uncorroborated testimony, he warned, the criminal overlords will thumb their noses at justice. Senator Samuel Greenberg's bills, patterned carefully after federal law, now languished in the Senate Codes Committee, dead weight sinking under political cowardice. In a side move that caught attention, Senator Harry Gittleson of Brooklyn threw another grenade into the conversation. He proposed a new law: make bettors, not just bookies, guilty of felonies. It was a bold, cynical play meant to highlight the hypocrisy of lawmakers who screamed about illegal gambling yet winked at its existence. If a bettor knows he risks being labelled a felon, Gittleson reasoned, he will stop betting, and if no one bets, there will be no bookmaking. It was a radical idea, one no one expected to pass, but it made a point loud enough to rattle the marble walls of Albany. Beneath the surface, the war was heating up. The gamblers and racketeers were not the only ones fighting to survive. Now, the lawyers, the judges, and the politicians were picking sides too. And in the middle of it all, the docks kept running, silent, ruthless, and untouched. February 1951 brought a new kind of chill to New York. It was not the icy grip of winter, but the slow tightening of a noose. On February 11th, the Brooklyn Eagle reported that the names at the center of the storm were finally being dragged into the open. Frank Bals, once the 7th Deputy Police Commissioner, had been subpoenaed to appear before the Kefauver Committee as hearings prepared to open at the federal courthouse in Foley Square. And he was not alone. The committee's dragnet was wide and ruthless. Subpoenas and voluntary appearances were pulling in the so-called elite of Brooklyn's underworld, from waterfront bosses to political operators, all under the flickering spotlight of the most high-profile investigation the city had ever seen. Bals, still bristling from his forced retirement and the accusations of graft that haunted his confidential squad, vowed to cooperate. Ready and willing to testify, he told reporters, though he made it clear that any request for a waiver of immunity would be seen as an insult. Meanwhile, the real thunderclouds gathered over former Mayor William O'Dwyer, now tucked safely behind diplomatic immunity as ambassador to Mexico. Rumors swirled that an emissary had been dispatched quietly to Mexico City, hoping to coax O'Dwyer back to New York. Whether he would agree to face the Kefauver committee was a question no one could answer. Behind closed doors, investigators mapped the intricate web of the Brooklyn underworld, a tangled skein of names that had risen from grimy corners into national prominence. Meyer Lansky, Joseph Profaci, Frank Erickson, James Moran. Each figure was tied to a larger machine, stretching far beyond Brooklyn's streets into the heart of America's criminal empires. The hearings at Foley Square would begin behind closed doors, but soon the world would be watching. By Valentine's Day, February 14th, the Kefauver Committee's search for the bloodlines between crime and politics had turned urgent. The Daily Herald reported that Senate investigators were probing the ties between political power and the racket bosses who ruled New York from the shadows. The witness list for that day read like a rogues gallery. Anthony and Albert Anastasia, kings of Brooklyn's docks, were summoned. Meyer Lansky, the quiet financial genius behind the syndicate's gambling interests, was called. Benjamin Crown, an associate of the Anastasias. Louis Weber, suspected of running a vast policy numbers game. Gerard Catena, a New Jersey gambler whose reach stretched into the smoky backrooms of South Orange. And there, woven among them, was Frank C. Bals once again, the cop who had risen, fallen, and now found himself under the Senate's burning gaze. In a revelation that sent ripples through the committee, it was disclosed that an upstate detective, known only as Stealthy Steve, had guaranteed safe passage to gamblers in Saratoga Springs for $10 a day. The connection between law enforcement and organized crime was not just a suspicion anymore. It was a festering reality. As the hours ticked by, the lines between crime and politics blurred further, the committee peeling back layers of protection that had shielded these men for decades. And the deeper they dug, the darker it became. By February 21st, 1951, the walls were closing in. The Daily News reported that Frank Bowles, the once proud deputy commissioner, was now slated to appear before the Brooklyn grand jury, investigating the very rackets he had once been trusted to police. Unless he had a last-minute change of heart, Bals was expected to refuse to sign a waiver of immunity, the same defiant stance he had taken before the Senate. "If they expect me to sign a waiver of immunity," Bals had grumbled from his Florida home, "they can go to hell." Assistant District Attorney Julius Helfand was unmoved. "Bals will go before the jury whether he signs or he does not," he said, bluntly. 19 former police officers who had served under Bals in the short-lived confidential squad were also ordered to testify. Created in 1946 by O'Dwyer himself, the squad had been disbanded just 2 months later by Police Commissioner Arthur W. Wallander, who famously declared that it did not make sense. Bals retired the following January, taking with him a $6,000 a year pension, and disappeared into the sun-drenched sprawl of Fort Lauderdale. But the past had a long reach. In a grim twist of irony, it was revealed that Bals had once signed a waiver of immunity back in October 1945, during an investigation into District Attorney O'Dwyer's handling of the Murder Incorporated prosecutions. At the time, he had been questioned about Albert Anastasia, Tony Spring, and a parade of other gangland figures. Now, 6 years later, the same ghosts had returned to drag him back under. March arrived with the sharp smell of fear hanging over New York and New Jersey. The Kefauver Committee was ready to pull the curtain back, and the world was watching. On March 11th, the Star-Ledger reported that the underworld's aristocracy would be paraded under the burning glare of the television cameras. Senator Estes Kefauver, with his wiry chief counsel Rudolph Halley, promised 6 days of public hearings that would lay bare the filthy marriage between politics and organized crime in the metropolitan area. Among those called to testify were giants of the rackets: Joe Adonis, gambling king of Bergen County; Albert Willie Anastasia, the cold-blooded enforcer once tied to Murder Incorporated; James Niggy Rutkin, an old prohibition relic; and Gerard Catena, an operator with deep gambling connections. Even a touch of glamour would slip onto the stage. Virginia Hill, former companion of the late Bugsy Siegel and frequent associate of Adonis, was expected to face the committee. The subjects Kefauver's team intended to probe cut deep. Waterfront rackets, bombings in Hudson County, the infestation of narcotics into American cities, and the sinister resurgence of the old Italian mafia, the Black Hand Society. Kefauver's investigators wanted to know if the shadow of Charles Lucky Luciano, now exiled in Italy, still stretched across the Atlantic. They also zeroed in on the waterfront, a grim battlefield where legitimate business still fought and mostly lost against union corruption, tribute demands, and quiet murders. Albert Anastasia had already been questioned behind closed doors. Reporters noted that when asked about waterfront killings, Anastasia had not even shown a flicker of indignation. The hearings were scheduled to run daily from 11 o'clock in the morning to 5:30 in the afternoon. But no one doubted that if the rot proved deeper than expected, the spectacle would stretch on into the following week. The public was urged to stay home and watch. Millions of households would have the dirty secrets of America's cities beamed straight into their living rooms for the first time. By March 15th, the darkness had spread beyond gambling halls and loading docks. The news journal revealed what federal narcotics agents had long suspected. The flow of heroin from Italy into America had exploded, and it traced back to one man, Charles Lucky Luciano. Agent Samuel Levine of the United States Bureau of Narcotics testified that smuggling from Italy had surged sharply after Luciano's deportation in 1946. When pressed, Levine confirmed it outright. The rise in heroin trafficking started almost immediately after Luciano's return to Italian soil. The committee heard that Luciano's network was not merely a relic of old mafia days. It was alive and thriving, using connections across Mexico, California, and New York. Distribution in the city itself was reportedly under the quiet command of a mob overseen by Thomas Lucchese, a name already blackened by accusations of union control and dockside extortion. Mass arrests in New York and Arizona had barely scratched the surface. Lucchese, despite repeated investigations, always managed to stay untouched. The cameras, still humming but forbidden from filming Levine directly, captured only the weight of the testimony. A wave of public horror spread outward as viewers realized heroin addiction, once rare, had become a creeping epidemic, especially among teenagers. Later that same day, the spotlight turned once again onto a familiar bitter figure, Frank Bals. Testifying once more, Bals admitted the unthinkable. He had never ordered investigations into Joe Adonis, despite knowing his reputation. Nor had he probed Frank Costello, the alleged kingpin above Adonis. Question after question revealed a stunning portrait of inaction. The confidential anti-racket squad, Bals insisted, had been more about gathering information than taking action. More of an information squad, he called it, claiming they sought daily crime analysis rather than confrontation. Yet even this modest goal had been strangled. 3 months after it was formed in 1946, the squad was broken up, a victim, Bals suggested, of departmental jealousy, and the fear among the brass that a real investigation would uncover too much. When pressed, Bals conceded something even darker. He believed that some of the top brass in the New York Police Department were corrupt. Pressed further, he admitted that fear of uncovering protection rackets had played a role in the destruction of his unit. The committee grilled Bals about the mysterious death of Abe Reles, the star witness of the Murder Incorporated investigations. Reles, once under heavy police guard, had plunged to his death from a window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, a bedsheet tied around his body in a crude escape attempt. Senator Charles Tobey sneered openly. "This whole thing is a tawdry mess, smelling unto heaven," Tobey declared. "I do not believe the whole truth will be told until Judgment Day." Bals insisted Reles had fallen trying to escape, but the sarcasm in the room was thick. Photographs, Toby mused grimly, would not show 36 stab wounds or bullet holes, would they? As the hearings dragged into the evening, another bombshell exploded. James McLaughlin, a former telephone company employee, testified that he had been paid between $300 and $400 to inspect Frank Costello's phone lines for wiretaps, payments made directly by Costello himself. This was a direct contradiction of Costello's earlier testimony. Faced with the obvious, Senator Kefauver announced bluntly, "Someone has committed perjury." The entire record, Kefauver declared, will be handed over to the Department of Justice for action. McLaughlin described the simple code he and Costello had used. If he called and said, "I'm feeling fine today," the line was clear. If he said otherwise, trouble was on the wire. Even more damning, McLaughlin revealed he had done similar checks on the telephone of William O'Dwyer in 1945, during O'Dwyer's run for mayor of New York City. Whether O'Dwyer knew about the surveillance was unclear, but the stench of corruption was unmistakable. In the courtroom, Costello, hoarse with laryngitis, sat hunched and nervous, keeping his hands carefully hidden under the table. The cameras, barred from filming his face, still caught the restless twisting of his fingers, the twitch of a cornered man. District Attorney Miles McDonald returned to the stand, pleading for stronger laws to crush organized crime. Wiretap evidence, he argued, should be embraced, not shunned. "This is a mechanized age," McDonald said. "If we cannot use progress, the other side will outstrip us." McDonald explained that, without at least partial police complicity, no large-scale gambling operation could thrive. Assistant District Attorney Julius Helfand took it further, describing how even schoolchildren gambled with spare coins. A cancer eating into the future. Helfand testified that over $300 million was wagered yearly on horse races alone in New York, much of it siphoned through shadowy wire rooms operating under police noses. When asked if the telephone company knew about the racket phones, Helfand answered without hesitation, "I think so." March 16, 1951, was the day Frank Costello decided he had enough. The Daily News captured it. Under the burning Klieg lights, surrounded by senators, reporters, cameras, and the full gravity of the United States Senate, Costello dared them all to act. Costello, the infamous racketeer, stood up mid-hearing at the federal courthouse in New York City and coldly announced, "Under no conditions will I testify until I am well." He had barely croaked the words out. His voice, ravaged by supposed laryngitis, was weak, but his defiance was ironclad. Ignoring the furious protests of Senator Estes Kefauver and Senator Charles Tobey, and brushing past the committee's chief counsel, Rudolph Halley, Costello simply walked out. In front of the television cameras, in front of 100 reporters, in front of the entire country. Kefauver, barely hiding his rage, promised immediate retaliation. The Senate would move for a contempt citation, a warrant for Costello's arrest, and, if need be, a full spectacle on the floor of the United States Senate. But Costello did not flinch. When Halley asked him formally whether he was familiar with the damning testimony given the day before by James McLaughlin, Costello refused to answer. "Do you refuse to follow the direction of the chair?" Kefauver demanded. "Absolutely," Costello said, his voice low but steady. Before he walked out, Costello's attorney, George Wolfe, waved a doctor's note in front of the committee, a certificate signed by Dr. Vincent Panettiere, claiming Costello was confined to bed with acute laryngotracheitis. Kefauver read the note, looked at Costello standing there, sharp-eyed and steady on his feet, and tossed the certificate aside with visible contempt. This was no sick man. This was a gangster daring the United States Senate to blink first. Costello's exit overshadowed everything. even the spectacle that came minutes before. Virginia Hill, the fiery former companion of Bugsy Siegel, had taken the stand, and it was a storm from the start. Draped in a silver-blue mink, stole worth at least $5,000, a wide-brim black hat perched on her head, Hill looked every inch the gangster's moll as she trembled under the Klieg lights. But her nerves gave way to rage. After barely tolerating Hallie's questioning, Hill exploded the moment she left the witness chair. In the courthouse elevator, she punched a girl reporter in the face. Moments later, she slapped a male reporter twice, before shrieking a torrent of profanities at the crowd of journalists. "You goddamn bastards!" she screamed, sprinting to a waiting cab. The committee had expected fireworks. Virginia Hill was not disappointed. Meanwhile, Frank Bals was back in the hot seat, and the mood was grim. Bals, decked out in a blue basket-weave suit, a yellow and blue striped tie, and a gold wristwatch, tried to maintain his composure under questioning. But the senators tore into him like wolves. The truth was simple. Bals had worn the title of 7th Deputy Police Commissioner for 8 months, but worked for barely 2. After that, he had drifted into the role of political ornament, drawing a $6,000 pension for doing next to nothing. Senator Toby, practically vibrating with disgust, hammered him. Bals had been given a squad to monitor crime and rackets, yet no comprehensive reports were ever filed. When the squad was disbanded, the files were found to be empty. Nothing remained. When asked about the death of Abe Reles, the murder, incorporated informant who fell, or was pushed, from a 5-story window while under Bals's watch, the former cop's answers grew even thinner. Reles, Bals said, had tried to escape. He tied bedsheets into a rope and slipped while attempting to descend from the Half Moon Hotel. Senator Toby was openly sneering. "What was he doing, trying to get a drink?" Toby mocked. Bals insisted Reles was not suicidal, just foolish. But nobody in the room believed it. The real ghosts of the investigation hovered around Albert Anastasia. Bals admitted under relentless questioning that during his time investigating Murder Incorporated, he had heard that Anastasia had the final say on who lived and who died. Permission to kill had to come directly from him. Yet, despite this knowledge, Anastasia was never apprehended, never questioned. The most wanted man in Brooklyn had slipped into the United States Army during World War II, hiding in plain sight, and not once had Bals' office thought to check with the draft board. It was incompetent, or something worse. The wanted card for Anastasia, Bals finally admitted, had been removed from police files. No one could explain how. The hearings dug deeper into the rot beneath New York's docks and gambling dens. Federal agent Samuel Levine testified that the narcotics flood swamping America's youth had roots in Sicily and France. But it was Charles Lucky Luciano pulling the strings from Italy. Luciano's old lieutenants, like Thomas Three-Finger Brown Lucchesi, Dominic Petrelli, and Trigger Mike Coppola, managed the heroin pipeline straight into Harlem and the Bronx. Walter Hedden, Port Development Director for the Port of New York Authority, described how shipping companies were extorted by mystery groups demanding tribute just to unload cargo. Philip Stevens, business manager of the Daily News, testified that his newspaper was forced to consider paying $300,000 a year, $1 for every ton of newsprint, simply to get paper past Brooklyn's piers. The crime was no longer hidden. It sat at the very heart of the city's lifeblood, the docks, the unions, the politics. Everything was touched. Everything was tainted. The parade of witnesses continued, each figure darker than the last. Frank Erickson, once the nation's top bookmaker, shuffled into the hearing from Rikers Island, offering little beyond blank denials and risking his own contempt citation. Joe Adonis, the dapper underworld figure who had long operated in the political shadows, appeared like a Wall Street banker in a tailored suit. Adonis claimed disinterest in politics, yet evidence piled up suggesting that politicians owed him far more than they cared to admit. The stories that emerged were chilling. Costello's unseen hand influencing Democratic mayoral candidates, wide-open gambling dens in Saratoga Springs, run with official nods and winks, shakedown rackets that bled New York's waterfront dry, enriching gangsters and impoverishing honest labor. And always, lurking behind these revelations, was the ghost of the old Brooklyn days, when Murder Incorporated had made killing into a business. Again and again, the name surfaced. Albert Anastasia. The perfect murder case, once heralded by a young district attorney Bill O'Dwyer as a guaranteed conviction, had dissolved into a mist of missing witnesses and dead informants. Most damning of all, Abe "Kid Twist" Reles, the government's star witness, had plunged to his death from a Coney Island hotel window. An escape attempt, officials claimed, though no one believed it. Now, 10 years later, Anastasia remained free. Summoned before the Kefauver committee, he prowled the edges of the investigation like a spectre, a living reminder of how power, violence, and silence could bury even the strongest cases. Hints emerged that elements within the police department itself, the top brass, had sold out their city, trading their badges for underworld gold. Against this backdrop of cold defiance and grim testimony stood the Senate Crime Committee, and 3 men who carried the battered hopes of justice. Rudolph Halley, the brilliant, even-voiced chief counsel, led the interrogations, cutting through lies with surgical precision. Senator Estes Kefauver, the tall, distinguished chairman, spoke with the soft drawl of Tennessee, steady, determined, unflinching. Senator Charles Tobey, the 70-year-old Republican from New Hampshire, provided the heart. Tobey joked and needled, wisecracked and badgered, but when the scale of the corruption became too monstrous to ignore, he dropped the act. One afternoon, live before hundreds of thousands of television viewers, Tobey broke down. He cried openly, his voice cracking with despair, declaring that nothing short of a return to faith, to religion, to decency, could cure America of the rot now exposed. The cameras caught it all. The city, the country, watched in stunned silence. For a moment, even the criminals of New York must have paused, because in that courthouse, for one brief, blinding instant, America saw itself. By the morning of March 20th, 1951, the stage was set. The hearings that had already shaken New York to its core were about to reach a boiling point. William O'Dwyer, now the ambassador to Mexico, took his seat once again under the hot glare of the Klieg lights. Gone was the confident mayor who once wielded the city like a king. Now he was a weary, defensive figure, leaning heavily on his pipe for calm as the Senate crime investigators closed in. He told the committee there was no longer any question. A national empire of crime was growing in America. It was not a local problem, he insisted. It was a national cancer that would only be stopped by a $50 million federal assault, a standing committee with endless investigative power, and the political will to fight syndicates that had woven themselves into the very fabric of American life. Praising the Senate committee's work even as he sparred with it, O'Dwyer admitted that big-time rackets could not survive without police protection. He painted a picture of City Hall perched atop a powder keg, haunted by invisible enemies. He said he had trusted his subordinates. He had depended on the honor of others. But in the end, he had been left fighting shadows, unable or unwilling to put his finger directly on the men who corrupted the city. The old scandals that had once simmered quietly behind closed doors now exploded into the open. Rudolph Halley, the committee's sharp-edged chief counsel, dredged up the death of Abe "Kid Twist" Reles, the government's star witness against Murder Incorporated. Reles had plunged from a 6th-floor window at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, with 6 detectives guarding him, all allegedly asleep. An accident, they had called it. A tragic coincidence. But Halley made it clear he was not buying it. He pressed O'Dwyer relentlessly, Had not the responsibility for Reles's death gone all the way to the top? To the police commissioner? To the district attorney himself? O'Dwyer, the former mayor, sweating under the lights but still managing a brittle smile, deflected. The tragedy, he said, was on the heads of the police department, not his. Meanwhile, Frank Costello was back, grinning, croaking, and dancing between disaster and defiance. When pressed, Costello admitted that he had helped install Michael J. Kennedy as the leader of Tammany Hall, the mighty democratic machine that had ruled Manhattan for decades. A favor here, a whisper there, a small nudge in the right places. And suddenly, the city's political heartbeat in time with the racketeer's drum. Halley asked Costello to explain his uncanny influence. "I cannot explain it," Costello shrugged, as if the idea of corrupting politics was as natural as breathing. Though he denied ever voting, ever donating, ever joining a political club, Costello still found a way to bend politicians to his will. The tension between the former mayor and the underworld boss crackled like electricity in the packed courtroom. O'Dwyer admitted, reluctantly, that he had met Costello at his Central Park West apartment in 1942. He claimed it was part of an investigation into wartime contracts at Wright Field. He insisted it was Sherman, Irving Sherman, a missing campaign fixer and pal of both Costello and Joe Adonis, who had arranged the meeting, not him. Sherman, for weeks, a ghost haunting the investigation, now loomed closer. The committee hinted he might soon testify. O'Dwyer, flushed and rattled under the questioning of Senator Charles Tobey, defended his actions fiercely, even as the senators chipped away at his story. When Tobey accused him of seeking favors from Costello, O'Dwyer shot back that it was Tobey who had accepted campaign money from New York interests. Clantiti takes sanse tannam. That nearly caused a brawl inside the hearing room. "You are not under oath," Tobey roared. "I will go under oath right now," O'Dwyer shouted back, his face crimson with rage. Beyond the drama between the politicians and the mobsters, darker currents ran. Albert Anastasia, the heavy-browed, grim-faced enforcer of Murder Incorporated, was dragged reluctantly into the proceedings. Wearing smoked glasses, complaining of sore eyes and conjunctivitis, Anastasia asked to be excused from testifying. The committee refused. The man once whispered about as the coldest killer of the Brooklyn underworld was forced to face the music. He blamed his sickness for his reluctance. But no one, not the senators, not the reporters, not the millions watching at home, believed a word. Meanwhile, Anthony Anastasia, Albert's brother, tried to paint himself as a peacemaker during a violent waterfront strike in New Jersey. Senator Kefauver, arching an eyebrow, asked if he was playing Good Samaritan. "No," Anthony growled. And in that one word, he revealed more truth than in all his testimony. As the hearings pushed deeper, the noose tightened around the necks of the empire builders. The committee exposed a network of bookmaking payoffs, police protection, and dockside shakedowns stretching from Manhattan to Hoboken. In one chilling moment, testimony revealed that strikebreakers hired by Phelps Dodge Company had gunned down a picket during a labor dispute, and no one had ever been prosecuted. Frank Costello, even as he played coy on the stand, admitted he had made Tammany Hall bosses keep promises to nominate judges of his choosing. He listed his close friends among election officials and Democratic power brokers, casually describing a system where politics and organized crime were merely two sides of the same coin. If there was a face to the horror of Murder Incorporated, it was Albert Anastasia. And now, under the pitiless spotlight of the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, the so-called Lord High Executioner of Gangland stood exposed. Anastasia, heavy-set, graying, his dark eyes as cold and pitiless as a winter storm, had been waiting a week for his turn to testify. He had lounged in the wings while others crumbled, sneered, or pleaded under the television lights. Now it was his turn. There was a savage irony in it. The man once entrusted with delivering death sentences for Brooklyn's underworld sat, unscathed, in his $65,000 mansion on the cliffs of Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson River, beyond the reach of prosecutors. Those who might have testified against him had been silenced, murdered, vanished, or claimed by mysterious accidents. Anastasia had built a fortress of corpses around himself, and now he was nearly untouchable. Years earlier, when the streets of Brooklyn ran slick with blood, it was Anastasia who handed down the verdicts. According to William O'Dwyer, then Brooklyn's district attorney, Anastasia presided over a secret court, a kangaroo tribunal of killers and thugs, where guilt was a foregone conclusion, and the penalty was always death. Murder and Incorporated was no myth. It was a national assassination bureau, operating with cold precision under the silent sanction of bosses like Joe Adonis, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, and Charlie Lucky Luciano. The men of Murder Incorporated did not just kill gangsters who crossed the line. They killed citizens, businessmen, witnesses, anyone who got in the way. And Anastasia was the general of their armies. The committee circled back again and again to the mysterious death of Abe "Kid Twist" Reles, the most important witness ever turned against Murder Incorporated. In 1941, Reles, a career assassin turned informant, had been kept under 24-hour guard by 6 New York City policemen at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. He was preparing to testify against Anastasia in the slaying of longshoreman Peter Panto, a killing meant to crush a rebellion against gangster control of the waterfront. But on a cold November morning, Reles fell to his death from the 6th-floor window. The bedsheets tied together in a pathetic rope told one story. The 6 police guards, allegedly asleep, told another. Senator Charles Tobey, blunt as a hammer, put it plainly. Reles had not fallen. He had been pushed, and the death had served only one master, Albert Anastasia. As Anastasia appeared before the committee, wearing smoked glasses and claiming conjunctivitis, he tried to project the image of a wounded, misunderstood man. "I have sore eyes," he protested. "I have been here 4 days. I am a sick man." But the Senate investigators showed him no pity. There would be no excuses for the Lord High Executioner. Even his brother, Anthony Anastasia, had taken the stand days earlier, admitting that he and all the Anastasia brothers had entered America illegally by jumping ship. Now, with deportation proceedings hanging like a sword over their heads, the walls around the Anastasias began to tremble. Still, Albert Anastasia smiled. All the key witnesses were dead. All the crimes were buried deep. He was the last survivor of an era drenched in blood, and he knew it. Back on the stand, William O'Dwyer fought to defend his record. He was calm and composed at first. Natalie, dressed in a blue pencil-striped suit and a blue and white tie. But as the lights bore down on him, as the questions hammered harder, sweat gathered on his brow. Senator Tobey tore into him over the conflicting accounts of Reles's death. O'Dwyer's testimony did not match that of his former subordinate, Frank Bals. The senator accused him of soft-peddling the truth, of sidestepping the rot that had hollowed out the police department, the courts, and the waterfront. O'Dwyer tried to steer the conversation back to slum conditions, to petty crimes, to pinball machines and gambling dens that corrupted children. But Senator Estes Kefauver cut him off sharply. The committee did not come here to hear about mint machines or urban decay. They had come to tear the mask off organized crime. And at the heart of it all, haunting every testimony, every accusation, was the silent, smiling specter of Albert Anastasia. By March of 1951, the American public, exhausted by whispers of corruption and scandal, had been glued to their television screens, eyes wide as the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, under Senator Estes Kefauver, dragged the underworld into the light. The hearings had promised fire and fury. They had promised justice. They delivered spectacle. Across New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, Miami, and St. Louis, the committee had peeled back a corner of the festering underworld blanket that smothered the nation's political machines. But for all the drama, the laughter, the tears, and the moments of raw confrontation that unfolded before the cameras, the committee carefully avoided digging into the deepest, most dangerous roots. They exposed the runners, the middlemen, the liaison brokers. They paraded figures like Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Albert Anastasia. But the true puppet masters, the Wall Street bankers, shipping magnates, steel barons, and political kingmakers, remained untouched, unnamed, unseen. Who pulled the strings behind Murder Incorporated? Who protected Anastasia, Costello, Adonis? Who held the leash when gangsters rigged the waterfront, terrorized the auto plants, and flooded the nation's cities with blood and narcotics? The answer, as many suspected but few dared say aloud, led straight into the boardrooms of big business and the halls of high government. On the surface, the Kefauver Committee looked fearless. They forced Ambassador William O'Dwyer to admit he visited Costello during World War II, supposedly in his role as a United States Air Corps general, to warn about black market operations involving hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen army supplies. They hauled in Joe Adonis. They grilled Costello until the racketeer croaked answers through his ravaged throat. They even dared mention Tammany Hall's long, cozy dance with the underworld. But they stopped short. They did not subpoena Joe Ryan, the kingpin of the AFL's International Longshoremen's Association, whose reign of terror controlled the eastern waterfront and whose political ties shielded gangsters and killers. They did not call the shipping firms, the loading companies, the industrialists who trafficked with gangland to make a fortune during the war. They did not mention that Henry Ford III's operations had once intertwined with Adonis, whose control of the new car carrier associations moved Ford's vehicles out of Edgewater, New Jersey. They did not touch the billionaires, the real empire of crime, where Wall Street, politics, and organized racketeering merged, remained safely hidden behind the theatrical grimaces of men like Costello and Adonis. The committee refused to probe Governor Thomas Dewey's administration in Albany, even though the trail of corruption led straight to his doorstep. They balked when Dewey invited them to Albany, a transparent ploy to keep the spotlight out of his capital. They ignored the fact that Dewey held William O'Dwyer politically hostage because O'Dwyer knew too much about the Pete Panto murder. Pete Panto, the courageous dock worker, had dared to defy Joe Ryan's gangster-controlled union in 1939. He had rallied the rank and file against the waterfront's bloody rule. For his bravery, he was lured to his death, his body cemented, hidden in the marshes of Lyndhurst, New Jersey. O'Dwyer, as Brooklyn District Attorney, had once declared he knew exactly who had killed Panto. Albert Anastasia. But no indictment ever came, because behind Anastasia stood the shipping companies, the freight operators, the waterfront owners, powerful men who preferred Panto dead and the unions docile. Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, went on living in luxury in Fort Lee, New Jersey, not far from where Panto's body was discovered, untouched by prosecutors on either side of the Hudson. While O'Dwyer and Dewey danced around Murder Incorporated, New Jersey officials were busy pursuing a different kind of justice, executing 6 innocent black men in the infamous Trenton 6 case. The irony was as thick as the blood drying in the gutters of Red Hook and Canarsie. While gangsters like Anastasia ran free, black workers were framed, brutalized, and sent to their deaths without mercy. The Kefauver Committee never mentioned the Trenton 6. It never spoke of the whitewashing done by men like Miles McDonald, the Brooklyn District Attorney who had exposed a $20 million gambling ring but remained silent about police brutality against Puerto Rican and black youth. It never questioned whether the same mobsters running illegal bookmaking were also the ones orchestrating the terror against union organizers and minorities in working-class neighborhoods. In Union County, New Jersey, the truth finally slipped loose. Prosecutor Nathan Cohn admitted that during the Phelps-Dodge strike, management hindered investigations into the Murder Incorporated thugs who had killed Mario Russo, a union organizer. He named Captain David Winkman of the Elizabeth Police Department, a man who had whitewashed Anastasia during the original grand jury hearing, as the obstacle who helped the gangsters walk free. Winkleman later helped arrest New Jersey Communist Party leaders for distributing peace leaflets, proving once again that law enforcement bent the knee not to justice, but to power. In February 1951, even as the Kefauver hearings played out on live television, union leaders from the Phelps-Dodge strike were still being dragged into courtrooms on fabricated charges, while the killers and their backers moved on to bigger, bloodier ventures. It was a spectacle, a circus of controlled outrage. The committee let the cameras roll, feeding the American people the tragic theater of crumbling gangsters and tearful politicians, while the true criminals, the ship owners, the auto magnates, the steel kings, the political bosses, remained securely behind their gilded walls. William O'Dwyer had washed his hands of the Panto case and been rewarded with a cushy ambassadorship to Mexico. Albert Anastasia lived like a king in Fort Lee. Frank Costello still whispered into the ears of Tammany Hall's kings. And the real machinery of crime, the machinery that mingled with Wall Street portfolios and presidential campaigns, ground on, untouched, and unstoppable. As March 1951 closed, and the Kefauver Committee prepared to submit its final report to the United States Senate, the question lingered in the smoky air of America's courtrooms and living rooms alike. Would they tell the truth? Or would the blood and betrayal be swept back under the rug, hidden once more by the same hands that had made it all possible? The audience, millions strong, leaned closer to their black and white television screens, waiting, hoping, knowing. There were wheels within wheels, and they were still turning. As March 1951 bled into its final days, a new storm broke across New York. One that reached back almost a decade, to a window high above Coney Island. The death of Abe Reles, the government's star witness against Murder Incorporated, had always smelled rotten. Now, 9 years after Reles's body shattered on the sidewalk outside the Half Moon Hotel, the case was stirring once more. New information, uncovered out of town by investigators working for First Assistant District Attorney Edward Silver, hinted at truths long buried. 40 witnesses were being called back into the fold. Even William O'Dwyer, now safely installed as the United States ambassador to Mexico, was being drawn back toward the fire. Summoned before a Brooklyn grand jury probing gambling, police graft, and the silent rot infecting the city's core. Reles had been the key. Reles had been the storyteller, the canary perched on a bloody perch. When he fell, or was pushed, from that fifth-story window in November of 1941, the case against the underworld's darkest lords plummeted with him. It was Senator Charles Tobey who said it loudest, and with the least fear, when he declared on a live radio broadcast that Reles had been murdered, silenced by the very lawmen paid to guard him. And as the days ticked down toward the end of March, the old suspicions gained new breath. Investigators were hunting old ghosts. They were ready to question Reles's widow, now remarried. They were looking for Anthony Maffatore, the Murder Incorporated chauffeur who had vanished into the fog, perhaps taken for one last ride to ensure his silence. And while Brooklyn turned over its dead stones, across the river in Brooklyn Heights, Joseph Anastasio, brother of the feared Albert Anastasia, was seized by immigration authorities. His crime? The same as his brother's, slipping into America by jumping ship, decades earlier. The web was tightening, but it was tightening too late for justice. When Albert Anastasia finally appeared before the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, he wore the look of a man confident the world could never touch him. His voice was calm, almost bemused, as he claimed innocence. "I never hurt a hair on a fly's head," Anastasia declared. It was a farce. William O'Dwyer, the former Brooklyn district attorney, now far from the muck in Mexico, had laid it all bare before the committee. Anastasia, he said, was the executive director of Murder Incorporated, the Lord High Executioner who carried out death orders issued by the highest councils of gangland. The combination, the National Crime Syndicate O'Dwyer described, was a vast, sprawling machine of blood and silence. It was directed by an invisible board of mob bosses: Lucky Luciano, exiled but powerful; Meyer Lansky, quiet architect of the syndicate's financial empire; Benny, Bugsy; Siegel, the West Coast kingpin; Joe Adonis, the East Coast's political manipulator; Willie Longy Zwillman of New Jersey; and Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the underworld. At their feet, Murder Incorporated the troops. Reles had told O'Dwyer everything during their first meetings, all the gruesome mechanics of gangland justice, how kangaroo courts were held in darkened back rooms, where hoodlums were tried by their peers, and where there was but one sentence ever handed down: death. Reles had warned bitterly, "You'll never get anywhere with this. I'm warning you, you'll never get anywhere." He knew too much. He trusted no one. He expected to be killed. And so, he was. His body found broken beneath a hotel window, supposedly guarded by 6 hand-picked New York policemen. O'Dwyer told the committee that he had built a perfect case against Anastasia for the murder of Moish Diamond, a labor leader who had stood in the wrong man's way. The plan had been to prove that Jack Parisi, a Murder Incorporated hitman, had executed Diamond under Anastasia's direct orders. The web was drawn tight, but Reles's death snuffed out the final light. The perfect case collapsed. No charges were brought. No verdict was reached. Instead, Anastasia, who had once sat on death row in Sing Sing, whose multiple murder charges had all mysteriously fallen apart, moved into a palatial mansion in Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson River like a dark king surveying his domain. O'Dwyer painted a chilling portrait of the true power behind America's cities, a nation divided and parceled out by the combination. Each mobster assigned his turf, his rackets, his dominion. Each rewarded not in cash, but with the spoils of vice: pinball machines, prostitution territories, waterfront control. Anastasia commanded the New York docks with an iron hand. Moretti and Zwillman ruled New Jersey. Siegel and Lansky carved up the West Coast, and all of them answered to an invisible authority, one that combined the raw force of gangsters with the quiet control of politicians, bankers, and industrialists. If one of their number betrayed the code, even whispered a forbidden truth, the combination would convene a court, and the troops would be sent to mete out the only sentence they knew. There was no appeal, no forgiveness, only death. While the Kefauver committee shined Klieg lights onto the hunched forms of men like Costello and Anastasia, the real machinery of corruption spun on, untouched. Brooklyn District Attorney Miles McDonald, who postured as a bookie buster, had himself turned a blind eye to the brutality of New York's police, whose clubs and bullets had spilled the blood of Puerto Rican and black youths across neighborhoods from Canarsie to Red Hook. And across the river in Elizabeth, New Jersey, it was revealed that even in the Phelps Dodge strikes, where Murder Incorporated, gunmen broke Union lines with bullets, men like Captain David Winkleman of the Elizabeth Police Department had been more interested in framing innocent labor leaders than prosecuting gangland killers. The American people saw the costumed villains, the gamblers, the enforcers, the thugs. But behind them, invisible, grinning, stood the true kings of crime, the shipping magnates, the auto executives, the steel monopolists, the men who pulled the strings and counted the bodies as collateral damage. By the end of March, as the Kefauver committee prepared to file its official report, millions of Americans clung to the hope that justice would be served. But behind the Senate chamber doors, the verdict was already written. Reles's body still lay buried beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Anastasia still lived in luxury. Costello still whispered into the ears of political power. And the combination, that silent empire of blood and wealth, still ruled from the shadows, wheels within wheels, turning unseen, grinding down anyone foolish enough to believe that truth alone could ever prevail. It was a cold, early spring in 1951, the sort of year when the city of Brooklyn still woke up under a haze of leftover winter smoke and factory breath. The winds carried the scent of change, of things shifting far beyond the sidewalks and the street lamps rooted deep in the city's underbelly. This time, the tide was turning in the marble halls of Washington, too. On an April morning, headlines blared across coffee counters and subway cars. Senator Charles N. Tobey, a New Hampshire Republican, stood at the center of a growing controversy. Days earlier, on live televised hearings, Tobey had read aloud a letter from an elderly man of Italian descent. A letter that spoke, some said slandered, about the Italian-American presence in organized crime. For Joseph Governale, a tax consultant and chairman of the Good Government Citizens Committee out of Bushwick, Brooklyn, it was a personal insult. Governale fired off a sharp letter, accusing the senator of unfairly indicting an entire heritage for the sins of a few. Tobey, sensing the firestorm gathering at his feet, wrote back with careful hands. He named the writer of the original letter Mr. Zavat, who lived at 214 Lawrence Avenue in Lawrence, Massachusetts. In his apology, if one could call it that, Tobey insisted that he had intended no slight, only to expose how racial groups had been manipulated by racketeers and politicians for selfish gain. Italians, he assured Governale, had contributed wonders to America's arts, sciences, and public service. But for Governale, the damage was done. He found the apology hollow, and the whole affair, as he put it, stunning. As political fires burned in Washington, a different, quieter storm was forming closer to the city's steel bones. Under the careful, relentless probing of District Attorney Miles McDonald, the Brooklyn grand jury, investigating the waterfront and police corruption, prepared to summon two big names: Police Commissioner James Shields and his predecessor, Chief Magistrate John Murter. The hunt was on, and the scent of dirty money and crooked badges led investigators far beyond the East River. Beneath the palms and sun-bleached shells of Key Largo, Florida, the romantic playground of pirates, bootleggers, and honeymooners, McDonald's men dug through property deeds and tax records, their hands sifting through the glossy fantasies of the island for the grimy fingerprints of New York's corrupt elite. It was no accident. A few months earlier, two Brooklyn cops had been found the proud owners of a Florida orange grove worth $50,000, a curious investment for men living on civil servant salaries. Now, with Chief Investigator William Dahout steering the ship, the Brooklyn team pulled records, searched land plots, and waited for the evidence to surface. No one knew yet if the Key Largo probe would yield gold, or just more shadows. But the investigators had a taste for blood, and they were not about to let go. McDonald, meanwhile, laid out his next moves with a tactician's patience. Starting tomorrow, he said, a series of former city officials, many of them handpicked by the exiled Mayor William O'Dwyer, would appear before the grand jury. Each morning would bring new names. On Thursday, he would announce Friday's witnesses. On Friday, the list for Monday. It was a slow, careful drumbeat meant to keep the targets off balance and the press salivating. Among the whispered names were William Whalen, once the chief of detectives, and John Flynn, the man who had run the confidential squad under Commissioner William O'Brien. Both had retired almost immediately after the September 1949 collapse of the bookie empire of Harry Gross, and after O'Brien's own resignation, which came like a thrown towel on the eve of a bad loss. They would not be alone. Frank Bals, a former 7th Deputy Police Commissioner, whose stunning testimony before the Kefauver Committee had cracked open the investigation into the mysterious death of Abe Reles at the Half Moon Hotel a decade earlier, was expected to be called. So too was James Moran, the former Water Commissioner, who had already been indicted for perjury in federal court after being caught lying under oath to the same Kefauver Committee. The Senate Crime Investigating Committee had already voted contempt citations against some of the biggest names: Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Frank Erickson, and the king of the waterfront rackets himself, Albert Anastasia. The machine was grinding forward, slow and merciless. Meanwhile, another shadow moved into the open. In a somber hearing room under the watch of Federal Judge Sylvester Ryan, the Immigration and Naturalization Service was ordered to produce Joe Anastasio, the brother of Albert, in court. His wife, Stella Anastasio, had filed a writ of habeas corpus, accusing the government of imprisoning her husband, not on evidence, but on the back of newspaper headlines. She claimed that Joe, who had been locked away on Ellis Island since March 27th after the Kefauver hearings, was being punished by association, a victim not of his own crimes, but of his brother's blood-stained reputation. Joe Anastasio, a man of few words and many secrets, had arrived in America by jumping ship in 1932 alongside his brother Anthony. Now, almost 2 decades later, it seemed that old sins, even those never spoken aloud, could still sink a man. The courtroom waited. Stella waited. And somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, the gears of justice, or something more brutal, kept grinding toward an uncertain end. The first week of April 1951 rolled forward with the heavy, restless energy of a city trying to catch its breath. Beneath the gleaming headlines about the waterfront rackets and courtroom battles, the world of high society was carrying on its own theatre of tragedy and scandal, though most of it never made the front page. One of the city's wealthiest families quietly buried a scandal, hushing up the suicide of a 24-year-old heir. It was passed off as a tragic gun accident, another misfortune in a family tree already too heavy with secrets. In another corner of the glittering social world, Barbara Hutton, heir to the Woolworth fortune, was rumoured to be settling her latest marital complications by offering her groom $300,000, a small price, it seemed, for the sake of peace. Elsewhere, the air was thick with rumblings. Joy Schuyler, a darling of the girl shows, and comedian Phil Silvers were making headlines with their very real romance, not just an April Fool's prank. Virginia Hill's husband, whose marriage had been stitched together with more ambition than affection, threatened to detonate the quiet split with public accusations. The scandals even stretched across the Atlantic, with Paulette Goddard preparing a hasty trip to Madrid, a city that had become the unlikely stage for U.S. Ambassador Stanton Griffiths and Spanish dictator Francisco Franco's diplomatic dance. But all of these society dramas were background noise compared to the real story unspooling behind closed doors. Federal agents, the revenuers, had quietly begun combing through the army warehouses in St. Louis. They were not looking for guns or boots. They were searching for paper, documents, army records, specifically the records of Brooklyn's most feared and powerful racketeer, Albert Anastasia. The agents were desperate to find out exactly when, where, and how Anastasia had managed to secure his American citizenship. Rumors whispered of 2 army buddies, long forgotten, who had vouched for his good citizenship. A detail that now threatened to unravel a crucial protection Anastasia had clung to for decades. If the truth was buried somewhere in the dusty file boxes of St. Louis, it would mean new headlines, new hearings, and new enemies for the man known as the King of the Docks. Back in New York City, The district attorney's office, led by Frank Hogan, had its hands full. The massive scandal involving the City College of New York basketball players, caught in a fixing scheme that stretched back years, had brought a fresh wave of disgrace. Hogan was preparing to launder the linen, as the city's gossip mongers put it, not just in sports, but within the powerful Patrolmen's Benevolent Association itself. A nest of corruption that the Senate's Kefauver committee had barely had time to scratch. And there was more. The girlfriend of a major figure in the ongoing crime probe, not Costello, but another dark horse with deep connections, was about to become a front-page sensation after the Income Tax Bureau and Hogan's team exposed the true breadth of her lover's hidden wealth. Hollywood was not spared from the reckoning either. 6 more sprawling mansions, silent behind high hedges and iron gates, were quietly seized by Uncle Sam for unpaid taxes. So far, only Nat King Cole's troubles had made headlines, but the storm clouds were gathering fast over the hills of Beverly. In the hotel lobbies and cocktail bars of New York, the rumors flew faster than the waiters. One day, it was news of a violent fistfight between a disgruntled music publisher and an official from the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, an all-out brawl right there at the Waldorf. The next, it was tales of princes and earls, entangled in romances more tangled than any American courtroom drama. But beneath all the noise, a quieter and far more serious drama was playing out inside the cold, echoing halls of Ellis Island. On April 6, 1951, Joseph Anastasio, brother of Albert Anastasia, the so-called Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, was released from custody on a bond of $2,000. Joseph had been held since March 27th, arrested on charges that he had entered the country illegally by jumping ship nearly 2 decades earlier. It was his brother Anthony, the Brooklyn and New Jersey waterfront boss, who had cracked the door open during his testimony before the Senate crime hearings. And with Anthony's confession still echoing in official transcripts, Joseph's arrest had come swift and cold. But on this day, District Director Edward Shaughnessy of the Immigration and Naturalization Service authorized Joseph's release, at least temporarily, as deportation proceedings loomed in the background. The shadow of Albert Anastasia loomed larger than ever. The city could almost feel it. The silent rage of a man whose empire was now under siege not only by politicians and prosecutors, but by the relentless ticking of history itself. The war on the waterfront was only beginning. By the second week of April, 1951, the winds off Coney Island carried more than the salt of the Atlantic. They carried memories, grim ones, about a man named Abe "Kid Twist" Reles, a ghost that refused to stay buried. District Attorney Miles McDonald, with the dogged patience of a man chasing shadows across sand, was digging deep into a case already 9.5 years cold. The case of Reles, the canary who sang but could not fly, was back in the headlines. MacDonald promised there would be grand jury action, no matter what his investigation turned up. A murder indictment? He doubted it. After all, the years had washed away evidence like the tide erasing footprints on the beach. But still, MacDonald insisted, the ghost had to be confronted, and there was only one way to do it: put the case before a jury. The story of Abe Reles was as much part of Brooklyn's dark heart as the crumbling boardwalk and the flicker of the old amusement lights. On the cold morning of November 12, 1941, Reles, the star witness against Murder Incorporated, and District Attorney William O'Dwyer's perfect murder case against Albert Anastasia, had fallen 6 stories from the Half Moon Hotel, landing lifeless atop a kitchen extension roof 42 feet below. Reles, who had once commanded killers with a nod and a grin, had been in protective custody for almost 20 months, first at the Bossett Hotel in Brooklyn, and then at the Half Moon. With a steel door guarding the hallway, with police posted at every choke point, with an elaborate system of telephone confirmations just to reach the squealer's suite, Reles had been more protected than a war secret. And yet, somehow, he fell. He had been singing for his life, spilling every secret about the inner workings of Murder Incorporated, where the bodies were buried, who ordered which killings, who pulled which triggers. Thanks to him, killers like Louis Lepke Buchalter and Louis Capone were marched toward the electric chair. Thanks to him, the death factory that had ruled Brooklyn's streets with cold efficiency was exposed to the light. But Reles was not just another rat. He was vital. His testimony alone could have tied Albert Anastasia, the one boss still walking free, to the bloodiest crimes Brooklyn had ever seen. Without Reles, the perfect case against Anastasia fell apart before it ever reached a jury. The setup at the Half Moon Hotel had been fortress-like. Reles, along with fellow informers Ali Tannenbaum, Maya Sykoff, and car thief Sholem Bernstein, lived under heavy guard. It was said that Detroit killers had even rented an office across the street, rifles ready, waiting for a clean shot through the windows until O'Dwyer's men flushed them out. Despite the fortress, Reles died. The official story was simple, absurdly so. Sometime around 7:15 in the morning, a detective named Joseph Boyle noticed that Reles was missing from his room. The window was open. When Boyle looked down, he saw Reles's crumpled body on the roof below, a bedsheet rope trailing out the window, tied, poorly, to the radiator. The story went that Reles, desperate to escape, had tied together his bedsheets like some dime novel Huck Finn, tried to lower himself down, and fell. But nobody who knew Abe Reles believed it. Reles was too careful, too calculating, too cold-blooded to stage an escape so reckless. Those who truly knew him, his wife Rosie, the few partners he had not yet betrayed, the prosecutors who had sweated every detail out of him, they all laughed at the idea. If Reles had planned an escape, it would have been airtight, not a sloppy dash with a handful of bed linen. The physical evidence only raised more questions. Investigators found that the screen in the window of the floor below had been forced from the outside. Scuff marks on the ledge. The window itself raised a few inches. It suggested that Reles had tried to swing into the lower window, or perhaps that he had been pushed. Then there was the liquor. The autopsy revealed a quantity of alcohol in Reles's stomach, enough to suggest he had been drinking. Enough, maybe, to knock him senseless, or to make him an easy man to throw out a window. Mrs. Rosie Reles, who had since remarried and changed her children's names to erase the stain of the past, reacted in a way that would echo for years. When she was told of Abe's death, she asked the only question that ever mattered. Who did it? She had no answer then. She had no answer now. In a whispered phone call years later, her voice thick with old fear and resignation, she would only say, "Please, please, I know nothing. My mind is a blank. I cannot say even a word." The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the Kefauver committee dragged the ghost of Abe Reles back into the national spotlight during its televised hearings. When former District Attorney O'Dwyer was grilled, he stuck to the old story, that Reles had died trying to escape. Former police official Frank Bals, however, showed hesitation, suggesting instead that maybe Reles had been playing a prank, trying to sneak around the iron door for a cheap laugh at his guard's expense. The public was not convinced. Neither was District Attorney MacDonald. Galvanized by the outrage, stirred by the hearings, MacDonald reopened the case. Assistant District Attorney Edward Silver led the investigation, prying loose old records from Police Commissioner Thomas Murphy, pulling the departmental trial records of the 5 officers who'd been on duty that night. Silver had the infamous bedsheets recovered, ordering forensic testing to determine whether the cloth could have supported the 174 pounds that had dangled from the radiator. Toxicologists reviewed the autopsy once more, measuring the level of liquor in Reles's body. There was even talk of exhuming Reles from his grave at Mount Carmel Cemetery, to see if time had spared any wounds, any marks of foul play hidden beneath the soil. The truth was out there, maybe, somewhere buried under layers of fear, corruption, and the cold passing of years. One thing, however, remained clear to everyone who had ever brushed up against Abe, Kid Twist Reles. He had not fallen. He had been thrown, and whoever had ordered it, whoever had finally silenced the canary who sang too much, had done so under the lazy November sky, in the quiet cold above the waves of Coney Island, where ghosts never stayed quiet for long. In the cold light of history, Abe, Kid Twist Reles, stood as a man few truly understood, a phantom stitched together by contradictions. He was not a large man, standing no more than 5 feet 4 inches, his stocky frame a compact coil of muscle and hard edges. His black kinky hair framed a wide face, a broad nose and small ears that barely seemed to register the world's noise. His arms were unusually long, his hands wide and strong, the fingers spatulate like a craftsman's, though the only craft Abe ever mastered was murder. Those who knew him from the old days, from the grey, crumbling streets of Brownsville, Brooklyn, remembered something different. His mother, Mrs. Sol Reles, who had come from Austria at the turn of the century, would later sit in her modest home and tell any reporter who dared knock that her Abi had always been a good boy. "If he is such a big man," she said once after his 43rd arrest, "would his papa have to sell neckties and suspenders from a pushcart?" Her voice trembled with both pride and denial, even as the record books told a different story. The cops, who knew Abe far better than they wished, kept the real score. By the time he died at 35, Abe Reles had been arrested 44 times. 6 of those arrests had been for homicide. He had been convicted 8 times, though somehow, through favors, fear, and the miracle of crooked lawyers, he had served less than 3 years behind bars. He had been a fixture in Brooklyn's police blotters from the tender age of 13. When he walked out of jail in 1935, after a stint for assaulting a garage attendant named Charles Battle, he found a welcome home package courtesy of The Combination, a crisp $1,000 and the keys to a new Buick. Abe told his mother he had been away on business. Charles Battle, meanwhile, wisely disappeared, living with the knowledge that he was supposed to be dead. Brooklyn remembered the winter night of 1933, when Reles and his crew had pulled into Battle's garage, honking and shouting for service. When Battle dared to complain about the noise, they beat him half to death. Later that night, when Reles returned and found Battle gone, his rage found another outlet. Alvin Snydor, Battle's relief man, who looked just enough like him to be stabbed to death on the spot. No one saw the killing. No one ever testified. The murder charge against Reles crumbled, like so many others. He was convicted only of 3rd-degree assault. The presiding judge had fumed. "This man is the worst character in Greater New York, worse than Dillinger," the judge spat, wishing he could bury Abe for a decade. Instead, Abe walked free a few short years later, carrying his rage like a loaded gun in his pocket. Reles hated the police. He hated them with a visceral, sneering contempt. Once, when arrested for vagrancy, he casually peeled off a $1,000 bill to post his own bail, an act of defiance more potent than any insult. In court, when a magistrate railed against gangsters and called them cowards, Reles merely growled, "I'll take any cop. Those G's have to count to 15 before they can pull that trigger." Still, for all his hatred, Reles was nothing if not practical. When it suited him, he used the cops like pawns. Once, locked in a deadly rivalry with a hoodlum named Jake the Bum, Reles convinced Jake to disarm under the pretense of partnership. Jake handed Abe his pistol. Abe shot him 6 times without hesitation, then casually smashed the window of a bakery to draw police attention, ensuring that when the news of Jake's death hit the teletype, Abe would already have a perfect alibi. He was that kind of man. Practical, merciless, smarter than the world he scorned. By 1940, with the walls closing in, Reles made his most infamous deal. He turned state's evidence. It was the only way to save his own skin. As a star witness, he demanded and received every luxury the district attorney's office could provide. His contempt for the police only deepened. He expected them to wrestle with him for his amusement, to fetch his meals and satisfy his whims. If they annoyed him, he simply refused to testify, holding the district attorney hostage to his moods. Kid Twist was not merely a killer. He was a supreme practical joker. He soaked toilet paper in water and flung it at the guards. He gave hotfoots with the precision of a carnival trickster. His cruelest jokes, however, were darker. Stories whispered among the old-timers told of how he once kidnapped an acquaintance's girlfriend and turned her over to his gang for rape. Yet, guarding Abe had its perks. The food was good, the best money could buy. And during the warmer months, excursions were arranged to places like Heckscher State Park, where the squealers could drink beer and play ball under the sun, pretending for a few brief hours that they were free men. After Reles's death, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia would call the witness protection system bad, but the only way. On the morning Kid Twist fell, there had been 5 police officers on duty: Detective Joseph Boyle, Detective John Moran, Patrolman Francesco Temponi, Victor Robbins, and Harvey McLaughlin. All 5 would be demoted after a departmental trial, scattered back to pounding the streets. 3 remained on the force still, their careers haunted by the ghost of Kid Twist, the star witness who had slipped through their fingers. During the Kefauver committee hearings, Frank Bals, now retired from the police department, testified that all 5 had been asleep when Reles met his end. None of them heard a sound, none saw anything wrong, until Boyle, making his morning check, glanced out the window and saw the broken body lying 42 feet below. Today, Boyle and Moran were retired. Tempone worked out of the Charles Street station, Robbins from the Gates Avenue station, McLaughlin from the East 51st Street station. But no matter where they patrolled, no matter how many beats they walked, the shadow of Kid Twist followed close behind. Abe Reles had taken his last joke too far, or so the official story went. But the streets of Brooklyn and the whispers of the waterfront told a different tale. Abe Reles had not fallen by accident. He had been pushed. By the middle of April 1951, the public's fascination with organized crime was no longer a fleeting interest. It had become a full-blown obsession. Across the country, the Kefauver committee hearings had dragged a parade of grim, unwilling underworld faces into the brutal light of television cameras. Men who had once ruled from the shadows now squirmed under the gaze of millions. In the New York Times, a sober piece by Emanuel Perlmutter laid bare what the American public had only glimpsed through courtroom theater. Murder Incorporated, or as the mobsters themselves called it, the Brooklyn chapter of The Combination. A machine of death and terror farmed out across the nation. The Combination was no neighborhood gang. It was a nationwide syndicate, slicing America into zones of exploitation, each with its own franchise of blood and corruption. In Brooklyn, the waterfront was their kingdom. Longshoremen were taxed a percentage of their wages simply for the right to work. To resist was to die. Peter Panto, a defiant longshoreman, Morris Diamond, a Teamsters Union official, Joseph Rosen, a truck owner, all 3 had tried to stand tall. All 3 ended up dead. Murder Incorporated reserved its most savage punishments, not only for traitors within, but for any civilian who dared stand in the way. Death was determined by secret conclaves, rubber-stamped by the bosses at the top. Men like Joe Adonis and Albert Anastasia, whose names flickered like specters over the city's dirty history. Yet despite their reputations, there had never been enough evidence to cage them. Adonis cloaked himself in the image of a legitimate businessman, hauling automobiles across New York. Anastasia claimed respectability too. A Pennsylvania dress factory, a mansion in suburban New Jersey. But beneath the crisp suits and phony smiles, the blood still clung to their hands. The only real threat they ever faced came from one man, Kid Twist Reles. Pulled from the West Coast by District Attorney William O'Dwyer, Reles had been the dagger pointed straight at Anastasia's heart. Until, one night, he flew out a window at the Half Moon Hotel. O'Dwyer, now the ambassador to Mexico, had testified under Kefauver's questioning that he knew Reles had the power to bring down Murder Incorporated's top tier. And yet when Reles died, O'Dwyer simply shrugged. He tried to escape, he claimed. But the story never sat right. Not with the public. Not with the few honest men left in the city. Rumors swirled now that Police Commissioner Thomas F. Murphy had new evidence in his hands. Maybe, just maybe, the ghost of Abe Reles would not stay buried much longer. But the rot ran deeper than even the Kefauver committee could drag into the light. It went all the way back to the death of a man named Peter Panto. It was July 14th, 1939, when Pete Panto, a fiery rank-and-file longshoreman leader, vanished into the Brooklyn night. Months later, they found him bound with rope, dumped in a lime pit in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. By then, the wheels of corruption had crushed whatever hope for justice still lingered. In 1939, William O'Dwyer had been the new district attorney in Brooklyn, a former cop and magistrate, selling himself as a gangbuster. He promised to break the back of the Waterfront rackets. Governor Herbert Lehman had appointed John Harlan Amen to investigate the Waterfront's gangster grip, and Amen's probe had produced names: Emil Camada, Gus Scanavino, Tony Romeo, the last men seen with Panto alive. But on May 15, 1940, O'Dwyer shut Amen's investigation down and took it over himself. And somehow, the three suspects were never questioned. Romeo became a fugitive. Camada and Scanavino slipped into the fog of the docks. On October 14, 1940, O'Dwyer publicly blamed Murder Incorporated for Panto's death. 3 weeks later, he announced he knew exactly who had killed Panto, and that arrests were coming. They never did. Behind the scenes, cracks appeared. Assistant District Attorney Joseph Hanley later swore under oath that O'Dwyer ordered him to discontinue the Waterfront probe. Police Sergeant Elwood Divers testified that he had been ordered to remove wanted notices for key figures, including Albert Anastasia, Tony Romeo, and another killer, Jack Parisi. The orders had come from James Moran, O'Dwyer's chief clerk. When Peter Mazzi, Panto's successor in the Waterfront movement, wrote to O'Dwyer pleading for action, warning that the same gangsters still ruled the docks, his letter was buried, marked Moran and forgotten. Even when Tony Romeo, one of Panto's last companions, resurfaced in Brooklyn in May 1942, 15 days after his wanted poster was mysteriously removed, he was quietly released by police. 2 weeks later, Romeo was murdered. The trail was gone, erased. When Reles was brought east to testify against Anastasia, it was not just the fate of Murder Incorporated at stake. It was the chance to expose the Waterfront's darkest crimes. But under O'Dwyer's watch, Reles too died. The Kefauver committee tried to crack the truth open. They grilled O'Dwyer under the hot lights. Senator Charles Tobey demanded answers. Why did those fellows in the room with Reles throw him out of the window to kill him if they knew there was no other witness? Tobey barked. Do you know they did that, Senator? O'Dwyer parried. Tobey pressed harder. He asked when O'Dwyer's perfect case against Anastasia became imperfect. When Reles died, O'Dwyer admitted. But he stuck to the same brittle story. Reles tried to escape. When Tobey challenged that, pointing to Frank Bals's theory that Reles was playing a prank, O'Dwyer could only shrug. How could anyone tell what was in Reles's mind? the committee faltered. Senator Estes Kefauver, perhaps sensing the danger of what they were uncovering, steered the questioning away. They let O'Dwyer slip off the hook. No subpoenas for Gus Scanavino. No subpoenas for Albert Anastasia. No indictments. No reckoning. The ghost of Peter Panto remained buried. The ghost of Abe Reles hovered above the city like a dark warning. And the docks, the lifeblood of Brooklyn, still belonged to the mob. It was in that cruel spring of 1951, as the nation gorged itself on the spectacle of crime lords humiliated under the hot glare of Senate hearings, as the waterfront rackets boiled over and the death of Abe Reles refused to stay buried, that another storm, darker and bloodier, began to gather. Behind the scenes, a different kind of desperation was taking hold. Albert Anastasia, the dark prince of Brooklyn's docks, had spent years moving in the shadows, commanding death with a nod, surviving scandal after scandal through a web of loyalty, fear, and brute force. But he was not a boss, not officially. He was a captain under the Mangano brothers. Vincent Mangano and Philip Mangano, the old-school dons who hated Anastasia's independent dealings, and Philip Mangano, the brother who followed him like a loyal shadow. Now, under the suffocating heat of public scrutiny, the balance could not hold. The pressure was unbearable, even for a man like Anastasia. His name was bubbling up too often, too loudly. The cops were whispering his name. The newspapers were starting to print it in bold type. Even worse, the old alliances were shifting beneath his feet. Money flowed like rivers from Luciano, Costello, and others to the high-ranking officers of New York's police force. Bribes, favors, quiet nods. Men like Frank Bals and his close associates, once seen as untouchable, were now stained by their own crooked fingerprints. Anastasia knew too much. He had seen how men like him could be sacrificed when it suited more powerful hands. And he knew that the Mangano brothers were not just a threat from above. They were a ticking time bomb. If they chose to give him up to save themselves, he would be finished. For a man like Anastasia, a man who acted without hesitation, whose violence was as instinctive as breathing, there was only one solution. In late April, when the newspapers were still busy picking apart the ghost stories of Abe Reles, and the Senate was still pretending to seek justice, history was quietly rewritten with a gun and a shallow grave. The Mangano brothers disappeared. It was brutal, quick, and final. The official story, pieced together by the bloodhounds of the press, began on April 20th, 1951. That Friday, the Flint Journal reported the discovery of Philip Mangano's body in a Brooklyn swamp. Philip, the quiet brother, the one who had always followed Vincent's lead, had been shot 3 times in the head. His body was found partly stripped, left like discarded trash among the reeds and muck. A high-ranking police official, speaking only under the veil of anonymity, hinted that Philip Mangano's murder might be just the first. A chilling warning to anyone who had dared to whisper too much to the Senate Crime Investigating Committee or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The whispers grew louder. Philip Mangano had met with the committee. He had talked to the FBI. Somebody, somewhere, had decided he had talked too much. But inside the twisted, airless corridors of New York's underworld, the real story was something colder. Philip's death was no purge of informers. It was a coup. Costello, ever the smooth operator, did not mourn the Mangano brothers. He liked Anastasia, respected him, even admired his capacity for action where others hesitated. Having Anastasia rise to the top only made Costello's own position stronger. But there was one man who saw deeper, who understood the flaw in what had just happened. Charles Lucky Luciano. From his distant exile, Luciano knew what Costello and Anastasia did not. The Mangano family, vast, sprawling, deeply rooted in New York's lifeblood, was too big for a man like Anastasia to handle. Anastasia, for all his cunning, was volatile. He flew into rages without warning. He promoted and demoted his lieutenants like a king scattering coins to the mob. He thrived on loyalty, but inspired as much resentment as fear. The empire he had seized with bullets would soon begin to crack under the weight of his own instability. The newspapers, always slow to recognize what the streets already knew, began to catch on by late April. Word filtered out in headlines and murmured editorials. Even the ink-stained cynics who had seen 100 mob wars unfold began to write what everyone was whispering. Albert Anastasia was no longer just the feared enforcer. He was now the boss. And all of New York would soon feel the tremors of the rain he had stolen with blood. The death of Philip Mangano hit Brooklyn like a whispered curse, passed from mouth to mouth in the smoke-choked corners of social clubs and waterfront saloons. And by April 21st, 1951, the full outline of his final hours had begun to leak into the public record. It was not some midnight ambush or back-alley setup that began the last chapter of Philip Mangano's life. It started, almost laughably, with a trip to the accountant. On the Tuesday night before he died, with the tax deadline looming like a hangman's noose, Philip Mangano, mafia hotshot, brother to one of the most powerful men on the Brooklyn waterfront, confidant to Joe Adonis and Albert Anastasia, had dutifully gone to get his state income taxes filed. His wife, Agatha, went with him. It was a nowhere an office somewhere near Van Brunt and Columbia Streets, tucked in among the docks and warehouses. A certified public accountant doing legitimate business with a man whose hands had long since lost any innocence they might have once had. After the paperwork was done, Philip left Agatha waiting in the car and said he was going around the corner for a cup of coffee. He never came back. It was not unusual, Agatha told Detective Ray Dukes of the Brooklyn Avenue station. Her husband was the kind of man who disappeared for hours, whose business and friendships lived in places wives did not ask about. She waited, and when the night grew long and heavy, she called a garage to come pick up the car and went home alone. 3 days later, Philip was found face down in the marshes at East 72nd Street and Avenue Y, 3 heavy .45 caliber slugs buried in his skull. He had been given the oldest of mafia send-offs, a one-way ride. No witnesses, no noise, no second chances. At their home on 84th Street in Brooklyn, Agatha and their 22-year-old son, Vincent, named pointedly after Philip's older brother, faced the press and the police with blank, shell-shocked faces. Vincent Mangano, the elder, the real boss of the waterfront empire, had vanished too. His body had not yet surfaced, but no one in the underworld harbored any illusions about his fate. The investigators, battered and exhausted, kept circling the same theory, that Philip Mangano had talked to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, talked to the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, maybe willingly, maybe not. Maybe just enough to make him dangerous. Detective Dukes and his men dragged in every hoodlum within reach, associates of the Manganos, soldiers of the old combination, questioning, threatening, sweating them for leads. But no one broke. Not yet. In the streets the message was already understood. The old order was dead. The waterfront, the rackets, the very bones of Brooklyn itself. They belonged now to Albert Anastasia. And the blood was only beginning to flow. By late April 1951, Brooklyn was sinking deeper into a swamp of fear and silence. The newspapers howled about the deaths of the Mangano brothers, but inside the city's soul, something colder took hold. Resignation. The old rules had been shredded. The underworld was rearranging itself, and Albert Anastasia, that grim, compact figure who ruled the waterfront with a butcher's hands, had become the storm at its center. But behind the blood and headlines, behind the cold killings and the fearful whispers, there was a quieter tragedy. The long decay of the Anastasia name itself. The barrel had been filling for 30 long, brutal years, ever since the brothers first jumped ship to enter the United States. Between them they had racked up 7 arrests for homicide, 3 for felonious assault, 3 for bookmaking, 1 for illegal possession of a gun, and 1 for vagrancy. Yet, despite it all, despite the blood and the bullets, only 4 minor convictions had ever stuck. There was a 5th Anastasia brother too. Not a gangster, not a killer, a man of the cloth. The Reverend Salvatore Anastasia, blue-grey eyes, handsome, sensitive, had studied for the priesthood in Italy with money sent from his brother's blood-stained hands. He had come to America only 2 years earlier, carrying hopes and prayers, until the torrent of scandals ripped them away. When the name Anastasia began to blacken every newspaper page, when the Senate dragged their family's sins into the light, Father Salvatore suffered a breakdown so complete that he could no longer even say Mass. The favorite brother, Tony Anastasia said, and now a broken man. But it was Albert who cast the longest shadow. 47 years old, dark and stocky, a face chiseled by the backrooms and bloodbaths of Brooklyn, a man the television audiences never got to see. He had testified before the Senate committee behind closed doors, cited for contempt when he danced around the truth about how he had made his living between 1919 and 1943. To the public, to the newspapers, to the Senate, he was the big fish who had slipped away. The Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated. The secret police of the mob's own silent empire. The man O'Dwyer had called his perfect case, until Kid Twist Reles fell 6 stories to his death at the Half Moon Hotel. And Albert never let anyone forget it. They never had a case, Anastasia said when he was finally tracked down. Not in a courtroom, but by telephone. The only way a reporter could pierce the fortress he had built around himself. His voice was smooth, barely touched with an Italian accent. Polite, controlled, dangerous. If they did, he said, they would have indicted me in 15 minutes. He was right about one thing. O'Dwyer's perfect case had crumbled the moment Reles's body hit the kitchen roof in 1941. And now Albert Anastasia was untouchable. He lived not like a king, but like a ghost. His white stucco mansion stood perched on the cliffs of the Jersey Palisades, a Moorish modern fortress surrounded by high wire fences, manicured lawns, tiny white statues, and a barking Doberman that greeted visitors with snarls and flashing teeth. Even the police chief of Fort Lee, New Jersey, had been turned away by the loyal dog and the silent gates. Only once had Chief Fred Stengel been let inside, looking for Vito Genovese, finding instead a smiling cooperative Anastasia, offering nothing but polite denials and an empty house. The neighbors knew him only as that quiet man, the man who never borrowed a cup of sugar, the man who never attended the bridge parties, the man whose windows stayed dark and silent even when the world outside burned. In his rare moments of self-defense, Anastasia pointed to his police record like a badge of honor. 5 arrests for homicide. But no convictions. 1 conviction for gun possession, but no prison terms for murder. In his mind, he was a man hounded by lies, painted as a monster because the newspapers needed a villain. They needed someone to blame. If I was guilty, he said, why didn't they indict me? But even as Anastasia defended himself, the shadow of his family's real empire crept into the conversation. Because across the river, in Brooklyn, his brother, Tony, was feeling the heat too. Tony Anastasia, the loud, combative, fiery chief stevedore of the Jerka Corporation, operated in a world where violence and influence were the currency of survival. He had run and lost 3 elections for the secretary position of Local 1199 of the International Longshoremen's Association. And every time he lost, he accused the system of being rigged. He had stormed through riots on the piers with nothing but a stick in his hand, shouting challenges at gangs of dock workers until the fights melted away. Tony denied it all, denied being a boss, denied controlling anything. When pressed, he would lean across his desk, fire in his brown eyes, and hiss, "Anybody who says Tony Anastasia runs the waterfront is a liar." But in Brooklyn, nobody needed to be told. The truth was etched into the sweat and grime of the piers. It was in the whispered threats, the broken contracts, the missing men. Gangsters ran the docks. Everyone knew it. Whether the names were Adonis or Anastasia, it made no difference to the men hauling crates and dodging fists. Still, the Anastasias tried to cling to a different story, a story of quiet lives, cold water flats, and small dreams. Tony, Jerry, and Joe Anastasia, the quieter brothers, saw themselves as working men who just happened to share a name with a killer. But the truth was never that simple. The Anastasia brothers had come from Tropea, Italy, a broken and battered family who had scattered across the world, some to Australia, some to stay in Italy, most to America. Their mother, old and crippled by war, still waited in a crumbling house for sons who would never come back. They had wanted to work, not steal. They had wanted to build lives, not empires. But somewhere along the way, on the docks, in the alleys, in the blood-streaked streets of Brooklyn, the Anastasias had become something else entirely. And no amount of family loyalty, no amount of bitterness or public denials could change what they had built. Tony Anastasia said it himself, pounding the wheel of his new Pontiac until the horn squealed, "This has got to stop! Me, Joe, and Jerry, we'll go to the district attorney and tell him who really runs the waterfront." But when the time came, when the car pulled up to the district attorney's office, Tony stayed outside. He stayed silent. Because even among brothers, even among the Anastasias, there were some truths too dangerous to speak.